Hi, and welcome to Lecture 2. This lecture is presented in two parts, and here we are in Part 1 where we'll be focusing on an introduction to technical communication. This definition of technical communication is something that you can read yourself, but I do want to emphasize one piece of information from it, and that is that word exchange. Technical communication is not about technology, it's about people, and it's about our interactions and exchange of information with specific people. There are, generally speaking, three main purposes of technical communication: to inform, to instruct, and to persuade. Technical communication, for example, doesn't typically seek to entertain or doesn't usually involve self-expression, which might be other documents' purposes. Now that said, sometimes documents have multiple purposes, but one of these purposes will always be the main purpose. For example, if I go to the cell phone store and pick up a brochure about the latest iPhone, I will be informed about the features of that phone, and I might even be instructed somewhat in how to use it. But the main purpose of that brochure is to persuade me to buy the product. You may wonder why, given your major or your intended occupational path, you need to study technical communications. You may think, I'm never going to have to be a writer. I'm an engineer, or I'm a computer science technologist, or I'm a nurse even. Why would I have to do technical communications? But the reality is that technical communications are part of pretty much all careers. In essence, everyone is a part-time technical communicator. Whether you're sending an email to your boss, whether you're sending an invoice to a client, whether you're speaking or writing to a colleague. It may not be the main focus of your career, but you're doing it every single day. So when you get better at it, it benefits your career, and also as you advance in your career, you'll find that you are more and more often required to use technical communication skills. You're more likely to have to be sending a memo or an email to the higher ups in your organization. You're more likely to be the one responsible for communicating with the client instead of the entry-level worker. And in addition, the better you're able to communicate, the more you are able to advance in your career, and the more you're able to market yourself persuasively to achieve new positions in your career. So far from being tangential, it really is a solid and important skill. Since technical communication is so important, let's look at some characteristics that make technical communication effective. First and most important, technical communication is user-oriented. That means that everything we say or do in our communication is aimed at meeting the needs of our audience. Technical communication needs to be accessible and efficient. That means it needs to be designed and written so that users can understand it and use the document quickly and readily, so they can access information that they need, get in, and get out. And also, technical communication needs to have three characteristics. It needs to be concise, which means you get to the point quickly. It needs to be concrete, which means that you have firm details and you're not vague or ambiguous. And it needs to be specific, so not overly general, that you have actual pieces of information that the reader needs. The tricky part is being concise, being brief, is sort of the opposite of having concrete and specific details. So those two things are sort of pulling in opposite directions, and we're seeking always to find the sweet spot in between. In a nutshell, effective technical communication will need to use an appropriate document, which is to say, the document form, genre, method of transmission that will be most useful to the audience, to convey our message that must be clear and specific, to the audience that we've identified as being relevant to our document. So in general, we're not just writing a message or communicating to anyone. We are writing to a specific audience, whether that is one person, a group of people, or a large set of people, such as prospective users for a consumer product. It's still specific. It's not just anyone. And the situation surrounding that audience and our need to communicate is also specific. And the information that we include will need to meet the needs of that situation as well. Now let's talk a little bit more about the concept of audience. In general, an audience is whoever is reading or using our document, our video, our recording, whatever it may be, and so that they are the people to whom we are communicating. Primary audiences are the main intended audience of the document. If I'm sending an email to a student, that student is the primary audience of that document. But some documents also have secondary audiences. They're not necessarily the person to whom the document is immediately addressed, but they're other people who might have called to see this document. So for example, maybe I'm writing that email to the student because of some controversial problem, and I decide, I'd better copy my supervisor so that person is in the loop as well, just in case they need to know about this. My supervisor would become a secondary audience. Now, not every document has a secondary audience, but it's worth thinking about whether your document might have that so that you can be aware of how you might need to address material in a manner that suits that audience's information needs as well. We want to think about our audience's technical background. We might be writing to a highly technical audience. That would be one specialist in a field writing to another specialist in a field. We might be writing to a semi-technical audience, perhaps someone who works with specialists in our field, but is not themselves a specialist. So an example of that might be if I am an engineer and I'm writing to my supervisor who is not an engineer. That person, because he or she works with engineers, may have some technical knowledge, but he or she's not a specialist. So I would use a semi-technical vocabulary and approach in my communication. Then there are non-technical or general audiences, just everyday people who don't know much about a specific field. Oftentimes, as a specialist in the field, you may be called upon to communicate with general audiences, and obviously, you have to use a very different approach than you would use for an audience of other specialists. And sometimes our documents have multiple audiences. They may be intended for our coworkers who are also specialists in the field, but also for supervisors or other relevant and affected parties who are not specialists in the field. And so we may need to create features in our documents that allow our document to be accessible by multiple audiences. In general, though, if you are writing to multiple audiences, you're going to want to aim it to the lowest level of technicality involved. So it's better to be less technical than too technical in most situations. We want to be clear to have effective technical communication about what our intended message is. So think about what your purpose is in creating this document. Are you trying to inform someone about an issue? Are you trying to persuade someone to do something about something? When you're clear in your mind about what your intention is, it will help you convey your message more effectively. You'll want to locate concrete and specific details that will support whatever your purpose is. If you're trying to persuade someone to do something, you'll want to have persuasive information that will be convincing to the reader. If you're trying to inform or instruct someone, you will need information that supports that purpose. And you'll also want to think about how your audience is going to respond to your message. We often tend to assume that whatever we're trying to communicate is easily understood and easily accepted, but the reality is our audience may not be inclined to do that. Our audience may be resistant to our message. Our audience may be in need of persuasion. They may be confused about things that are transparent to us. So you need to get inside your audience's head and think about the information that you can include that would sort of preempt some of those reactions and questions. You also need to think about what is the situation that is surrounding this interaction between you and your audience. Part of that will involve how the audience will use the document. What will it allow your audience to do? How physically will they use this document? So that'll influence some of our choices for medium of presentation. For example, if you know your audience is going to be using your document in an office, you may be able to provide an electronic form of the document. But if the document needs to be taken out into the field, it may need to be a print document. Think about how your document is going to help the audience accomplish its purpose. That's the reason the audience is reading your document, because the audience, the user, has his or her own purpose. And so if our document is not aimed at that purpose, it's not going to be effective. Other factors that might influence the context would include just general background. What's the history of this situation? Is there are there things that have gone before that would influence the reader's understanding of the situation, that influence the reader's needs here? Are we writing to an individual? Are we writing to a whole institution that has its own culture, that has its own needs that are separate from the individual's needs and expectations, perhaps? And cultural factors can be institutional. Every business, school, or organization has its own culture, but we could also be talking about other kinds of cultural factors, such as working across different foreign languages, different international cultures, different even religious cultures, cultures associated with age. It's different to communicate with an older person than with a younger person. So these are all things that sort of surround our situation that we need to be aware of. And it's very important to know what the audience's preference is in terms of communication. Obviously, it would not be a good idea to send someone a 10-page printed report if they only wanted a 1-page email, and vice versa. So think about what your audience is expecting in terms of this document. Think about your tone. Should you be writing in a very formal fashion? Is this someone well known to you that you can be casual in? Think about when the document is needed. A document could be great, but if it's not received until a week after it's needed, at that point it's worthless. If you're not sure what your audience wants, ask. Sometimes in our class, in terms of assignments, that's all spelled out for you. But sometimes in the real world, you need to ask.